The wind howled outside, but inside Eli Walker's cabin, the warmth from the fire barely reached the far corners. As the cold crept through every crack, Eli knew something had to change. The harsh Appalachian winters had tested him for years, but now it was his cabin that would face the ultimate trial. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. Eli Walker stepped inside his cabin, a gust of wind following him in from the open door. The snowstorm outside was fierce, and even though the fire crackled in the hearth, the chill never seemed to leave the cabin. He rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them, but it wasn't enough. The cold seeped through every crack in the logs, no matter how much he fed the fire. His wife, Martha, sat near the hearth, wrapped in a woolen blanket, her hands clutching a steaming mug of tea. She tried to smile at him, but the shiver in her shoulders made her efforts look weak. Eli glanced up at the ceiling, his eyes falling on the gap between the beams and the roof, as they always did. The cabin was built with care, the walls solid, the fire hearty, but there was always something missing. The heat from the fire rose to the top of the room, gathered above them, then quickly escaped through the gap in the ceiling or seeped into the wooden beams. No matter how many logs he threw on the fire, no matter how much he worked the draft, it never quite felt warm enough. "Cold again, isn't it?" Martha's voice broke through his thoughts. He nodded, though he didn't need to say anything. It was always cold. Eli looked down at her, then back up at the ceiling. It was a strange thing to consider, the thought of warmth trapped in a place it didn't belong. He wasn't an engineer, not by any stretch of the imagination, but he had spent enough years in the mountains to know that survival wasn't just about being tough, it was about being smart. And Eli Walker was nothing if not smart. The fire was the heart of the cabin, but it seemed inefficient, wasting heat where it could do the most good. For the first time in years, Eli allowed himself to consider something daring. What if that gap, that seemingly insignificant feature of the cabin, could be used for something more? He wondered what would happen if he could make the heat flow, not just rise, but move across the room, filling every corner. He felt a flicker of excitement in his chest, the way he did when he had a problem in his sights. He didn't know yet if his idea would work, but there was something about the design that made sense to him, a feeling in his gut that told him he had stumbled onto something important. That night, as the wind howled outside and Martha slept beside him, Eli stayed awake, jotting down notes and sketches in the dim firelight. It wasn't just a gap in the ceiling anymore. It was a potential solution, and tomorrow he would start building it. Eli woke early the next morning, the fire already low in the hearth. Outside, the snowstorm had not relented, blanketing the land in a thick, icy layer. He stretched, then dressed quickly, his breath visible in the cold air that slipped through the cabin's cracks. Martha was already up, stirring something in a pot on the stove. Her quiet presence in the mornings had always been a comforting routine for Eli, though today there was something different in the air. "You're still at it, then?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern as she glanced over her shoulder at him. "I thought you'd be finished with your ideas by now." Eli didn't respond right away. Instead, he moved to the hearth, stoking the fire a little more and letting the flames lick higher. The cabin always felt like it was on the edge of warmth, like a fire that could easily burn itself out if it wasn't tended to constantly. He looked up at the ceiling again, that same gap above him, and a surge of determination filled him. It wasn't a mere draft he was dealing with, it was the very fabric of the cabin's design, and he would make it work. "I think I've figured it out," he said finally, turning toward her. "That gap, it's not just a flaw, it's a chance to make this cabin warmer without feeding the fire all day and night." Martha raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Eli was used to her quiet skepticism. It had always been there, but there was no malice in it, just the realism that came from living in the harshness of the Appalachian mountains. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said, a bit more intrigued now. Eli began pacing, his hands gesturing as he spoke. "What if we use the gap in the ceiling for heat circulation? Not just for letting the smoke out, but for letting the heat rise and move. I've been reading the fire's movements, watching how the warmth gathers at the top, and I think if we can create a system where the air flows properly, we'll warm this whole cabin with far less effort." He paused, looking at her for a reaction. She didn't speak, but her thoughtful silence told him she was listening, at least. "It'll take some time, some work," he continued, "but I believe if I carve out the right channels in the ceiling around the beams, it'll force the air to circulate. The heat will travel through the walls, filling the whole cabin." He nodded, as if the idea was becoming more real with each word. Martha stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the snow-covered trees and the harsh, wintry landscape. "And you're sure this'll work?" "I don't know," Eli admitted. "But it's the only idea I've got. We need to do something. The fire's not enough." Martha turned to face him, eyes soft but steady. "Then let's give it a try. But don't be mad if it ends up being more work than you thought. And remember, this isn't just about keeping warm, it's about survival." Eli smiled, a rare expression of joy. "I know. I'll make it work. I have to." Eli spent the rest of the morning gathering the materials he would need: an old draw knife, a few sharp chisels, and a bucket of fresh clay. Martha watched him carefully as he worked, her skepticism still lingering in her eyes, but there was no stopping Eli when he got an idea in his head. Once his mind was made up, it was as if the world itself would have to bend to his will. With the fire smoldering low and the snow still falling heavily outside, Eli took a step back to consider his cabin. The ceiling was old, the logs darkened by years of use and the elements, but the structure was solid. He just needed to figure out how to rework it, to carve out that gap in the ceiling and redirect the heat. It would require a few modifications, the likes of which no one had tried before in this part of the Appalachian Mountains. But Eli was sure that this was the solution. The heat needed to move up, down, across the room, and he had to create a path for it. Eli started with the ceiling beams, carefully measuring the gap between each one. The logs had settled over time, some of them slightly askew, which would make the task harder. He pulled his draw knife across one of the beams, stripping away the bark and smoothing the surface, leaving only the solid wood beneath. It was backbreaking work, but it was necessary to create a clean path for the heat to flow through. Each log was painstakingly cut and measured. The more Eli worked, the more convinced he became that this system, however unusual, could work. The natural thermals of the cabin could be harnessed. But first, the ceiling would need to be altered. He couldn't just leave the gap as it was. He would need to shape it, carve it with precision. The smell of fresh-cut wood filled the cabin as Eli continued to work, and Martha stood by, her arms crossed, observing the process. She didn't ask questions. She knew that Eli's mind was set, and once it was, there was no swaying him. After several hours, the ceiling began to take shape. Eli had carved out small channels along the beams, deliberate, measured gaps where warm air could be directed. He paused, wiping the sweat from his brow. The cabin felt warmer already, just from the activity. He could almost feel the heat gathering in the newly exposed sections of the ceiling. By late afternoon, Eli was tired but satisfied with his progress. The work wasn't easy, but he was determined to see it through. He stood back, taking in the room. The fire was low, but the air felt thicker, warmer. For the first time, it seemed like the heat was lingering longer, flowing more evenly throughout the cabin. Martha, too, seemed to notice the difference. She pulled the blanket off her shoulders and stood beside Eli, watching the fireplace. "Maybe it'll work," she said quietly. "Maybe it will." Eli didn't answer immediately, his focus still on the ceiling. He knew this was just the first step, but it was a crucial one. Now it was all about testing his theory. He needed to see if the air would actually circulate the way he hoped. He didn't dare speak his next thought aloud. What if it didn't work? What if the gap, no matter how carefully constructed, couldn't make enough of a difference? But that was a thought for later. For now, there was only one thing left to do: test the system. The following morning, Eli stood in the center of his cabin, eyeing the fire carefully as it crackled in the hearth. The wind howled against the logs outside, but inside there was a strange, almost promising warmth hanging in the air. It wasn't as intense as the heat from the fire itself, but it was more evenly distributed across the room than it had been in the past. Martha was tending to the fire, her fingers careful as she fed the flames, keeping them steady. Eli could, until she was watching the warmth more closely than usual, her curiosity piqued. "Do you think it will last?" she asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, as though speaking too loud might disturb the balance they were hoping for. Eli didn't answer immediately. He was watching the small, deliberate gaps in the ceiling that he'd carved out the day before. The channels were crude, rough in places, but they had a purpose. Eli had created an invisible flow, directing the heat upwards and across the beams. He'd also placed a few logs along the walls, allowing the rising warmth to move downward once it reached the ceiling, hoping that the flow would circulate back to the far corners. The fire burned steadily now, the cabin already feeling warmer than it had the day before. But Eli needed proof. He needed to see if the air was moving, if the cabin would stay warm without constant tending to the flames. He stood by the fire, watching the swirling smoke rise up the chimney. For a moment, he was lost in thought, the crackling sound of burning wood filling the space. Then he walked over to the far side of the cabin and stood by the wall, pressing his hand against the rough logs. He could feel warmth more than he expected. The heat, instead of rising and dissipating into the ceiling, seemed to be holding steady against the wall, filling the entire room. Martha joined him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she placed her hand on the wall, too. "It's warmer," she said softly, her voice filled with surprise. Eli nodded, the realization hitting him with quiet satisfaction. "It's working," he murmured. For the first time it seemed like the cabin's temperature was stabilizing. The walls were no longer cold to the touch, and the chill of the air didn't bite as harshly. He walked to the farthest corner, his boots creaking against the wooden floor. The warmth had reached every part of the cabin, from the far walls to the ceiling above. The system, it wasn't perfect, it would need more refinement, but it was functioning. Heat was moving in ways that it hadn't before, and for Eli, that was the first step in proving that his idea could change everything. Martha glanced at him and smiled, a small but genuine expression. "Looks like your crazy idea might just work after all." Eli gave her a quiet smile in return, but his eyes remained fixed on the warm, evenly lit cabin. There was more to be done, but for now, he could finally feel the warmth spreading, and for the first time, it wasn't just coming from the fire. As the days passed, Eli continued to tweak his design. The cabin, now comfortably warm, seemed to be holding its heat longer than before. But the more he observed, the more he realized that it wasn't perfect. The warmth was spread more evenly, yes, but there were still places where the air seemed stagnant, corners where the heat barely reached. Martha noticed it too. While she had been grateful for the improvement, she started to express her doubts. One evening, as the fire crackled low, she looked over at Eli, her brow furrowed. "I don't know, Eli. It's warmer, sure, but it's still not quite right," she said, her voice soft but filled with concern. "It's not constant. Some parts of the cabin still get cold by morning." Eli had been feeling the same unease. The system was working better than he expected, but it wasn't flawless. The heat that moved through the ceiling and across the walls still seemed to dissipate too quickly. It didn't last long enough, especially during the coldest nights. The fire had to be stoked more often than he wanted, and the effort seemed endless. He sat back in his chair, staring into the fire, trying to calm his mind. The warmth in the cabin felt good, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "I think it's the channels," Eli muttered, more to himself than to Martha. "They're too small. The heat can't travel as far as it needs to." Martha didn't reply right away. She sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance, clearly deep in thought. Then, after a long silence, she spoke. "You've been at this for weeks now, Eli," she said gently. "You've put everything into it, but maybe it's time to step back. Sometimes trying to fix things too much just makes them worse." Eli looked at her, his heart sinking a little. He knew she was right. It had become an obsession, this idea of perfecting the heat in the cabin, but it wasn't just about comfort anymore. It was about proving something to himself. That his solution could work, that he could survive, even thrive, in the harsh winters of the mountains. He stood up, pacing across the cabin. The coldness creeping in again reminded him that he wasn't done. There was more to fix, and he wasn't going to give up now. "I can make it better," Eli said firmly. "I'll widen the channels, make them bigger, and maybe change the direction of the airflow. There's still time. I'll get it right. Martha nodded, though her face remained uncertain. She knew Eli well enough to understand his determination, but she also feared that this relentless pursuit could lead him down a path of frustration. "I just don't want you to lose sight of what matters," she whispered. Eli paused, meeting her eyes. "I won't. I'll get this right, Martha. I promise." Eli woke before dawn, the faint light of morning creeping through the cracks in the log walls. The cabin was cold again, the fire long dead. He rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the chill as he rose from his bed. Martha was still asleep, wrapped in a thick woolen blanket, her breathing steady and deep. It had been a restless night. Despite his best efforts, the heat distribution still wasn't right. The channels he had carved into the ceiling weren't enough. The warmth from the fire still struggled to reach the farthest corners of the room. Eli had spent hours the previous day trying to widen the gaps and improve the airflow, but nothing seemed to make a real difference. The problem, he realized, was deeper than just the channels. The fire wasn't powerful enough to move the heat efficiently across the space. He needed more air circulation. Eli stepped out into the cold morning air, the crisp bite of winter sinking into his skin. He took a deep breath, then grabbed the axe and set to work. He wasn't sure what he was looking for yet, but something inside him told him he needed to act quickly. The last few weeks had been exhausting, and every time he thought he had a solution, it didn't work the way he imagined. As he chopped through the woodpile, an idea began to form. Maybe the problem wasn't just in how the heat moved through the cabin. Maybe he needed to create a system to pull the heat into the lower levels where it could spread across the room before being sucked up into the ceiling. And again, he thought about the old stone fireplaces he'd seen in other cabins, those with chimneys that created strong drafts, pulling air up and across the room. What if he could use the existing fireplace and its chimney to improve the airflow? Eli set to work immediately, cutting through the logs he had stacked outside, stripping them of their bark, and trimming them down to size. He worked in silence, his breath heavy with the exertion. As he measured, cut, and carved, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He would install a new vent system at the base of the firebox, connecting it to the ceiling channels he had already built. The hot air would rise through the chimney and circulate across the room, drawing the cool air back down to the fire. It wasn't going to be easy, but Eli had finally figured it out. By midday, Eli had his new system in place. The vent was positioned just below the firebox, leading to the channels in the ceiling. He stepped back, surveying his work, feeling a cautious optimism rise within him. That evening, as the fire crackled to life again, he watched the heat move differently this time. The warmth spread quicker, more evenly, reaching the corners of the cabin. The air felt different, softer, warmer. For the first time in weeks, Eli felt a sense of relief. The breakthrough had come, and the cabin was warmer than it had ever been. The next few days brought a strange calm to Eli. The system he had installed was working better than he had ever hoped. The cabin felt warmer now, and for the first time, he didn't have to tend to the fire every hour. The heat lingered, filling the space even as the fire burned low. He felt a quiet satisfaction as he sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance without the usual anxiety that came with each dying ember. Martha, too, seemed to notice the change. She moved more freely through the cabin, no longer wrapped in thick blankets or shivering by the fire. The temperature was consistent, comfortable even in the darkest corners. Still, there was something about the quiet warmth that troubled Eli. It wasn't the comfort that bothered him, it was the fact that it had come too easily. He had expected more difficulty, more trial and error. But the breakthrough had come so suddenly, almost effortlessly. There had been no major failures, no catastrophic mistakes. The fire, the channels, the vent it had, all come together just as he had imagined. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. One evening, after a long day of work, Eli found himself sitting alone by the fire. The crackling of the logs was soothing, but his mind wandered. He thought about all the people he'd met over the years, the other mountain men, the settlers, the men who had shared stories about their own struggles with the cold. Many had learned to survive in the harsh Appalachian winters, but none had ever done what he was doing now. His innovation, while simple, had set him apart. And yet, There was no one to share it with. Eli sighed and leaned back, gazing at the ceiling. The gap in the beams, now purposefully crafted, no longer seemed like a flaw. It had become a symbol of his persistence, his ability to find solutions where none seemed possible. Yet, the longer he stared at it, the more it seemed to taunt him. How many other problems had he solved, only to find that his answers brought more questions? Martha entered the room, bringing with her the scent of fresh bread. She set the loaf down on the table, and Eli smiled up at her. "You're quiet tonight," she said, sitting beside him. Her voice was gentle, but there was a knowing in her eyes. "I've been thinking," Eli muttered, rubbing his temples. "About the cabin, about everything I've done. It feels too easy now." Martha placed her hand on his arm. "You've done something no one else has, Eli. You should be proud." He met her gaze, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his chest. "Maybe. But I can't help wondering what happens when things stop working. What happens when the heat doesn't last, or the system breaks down?" She smiled, squeezing his hand. "You'll figure it out. You always do." Eli sat in silence for a moment longer, letting the warmth of the fire fill the space between them. Whatever came next, he knew one thing. He had created something that would last. But would he be able to accept that it was enough? The weeks that followed were filled with quiet satisfaction. Eli's cabin, once a cold, drafty structure, now held warmth consistently, day and night. The fire burned more efficiently, the heat circulating naturally through the channels he had created. Eli could spend the evenings with Martha without the constant need to stoke the fire, and the cold that had once bitten at his skin no longer seemed so threatening. Yet, for all the comfort, there was still something Eli couldn't shake. The mountain winters were unpredictable. One warm day could lead to a fierce storm the next. The quiet peace of the cabin was like a fragile truce with nature, and Eli couldn't help but wonder when it would all come crashing down. One afternoon, while Eli was outside gathering firewood, a sharp wind began to blow in from the north, dark clouds gathering quickly overhead. By the time he returned to the cabin, the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, followed by a flurry of wind that howled through the trees. Martha was already closing the shutters and preparing for the storm. Eli couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety. The fire had been low all morning, and while the cabin had stayed warm, he didn't know how it would fare during a long, intense snowstorm. He had tested his system under normal conditions, but a storm could bring conditions far harsher than he could predict. Martha noticed the concern on his face as he entered. "It'll be fine," she said, though her words lacked their usual certainty. Eli didn't reply. He stepped toward the fire, stoking it carefully, adding more wood to ensure it was steady. His fingers moved quickly, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the swirling storm outside. By nightfall, the snow had become a full-blown blizzard. The wind was fierce, howling against the cabin as though trying to tear it down. Inside, the warmth was still holding steady, but Eli couldn't relax. Every creak of the walls, every gust of wind against the roof, had him listening, waiting for something to go wrong. As the storm raged on, Eli sat by the fire, watching the flames flicker in the hearth. The air was thick with heat, yet there was an underlying tension in the room. The warmth wasn't constant anymore. Every few minutes, Eli would walk to the farthest corners of the cabin, checking the temperature. He could feel the air growing cooler, the warmth from the fire struggling to reach the farthest walls. Martha noticed him pacing, her brow furrowed. "You've done all. You can, Eli," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We'll make it through this, just like we always do." But Eli wasn't sure anymore. The storm outside was testing everything: the ceiling gaps, the system, the design he had worked so hard to perfect, and it felt like it was only a matter of time before he would face his greatest test. The storm raged through the night, relentless in its fury. The wind battered the cabin, and the snow piled up outside, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Eli could hear the creaking of the logs as the cold pressed against them, but the fire still burned strong. Still, the unease gnawed at him. Every gust of wind felt like it might tear through the very walls he had worked so hard to fortify. He could feel the temperature shifting in the corners, the air growing colder, despite the fire. Eli stood up and walked to the far side of the cabin again, checking the walls, running his hand along the logs. The heat from the fire wasn't reaching as far as it had before. It wasn't a sudden failure, but a slow, creeping cold that seemed to grow stronger with every hour the storm stretched on. Martha, sensing his growing concern, walked over to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's holding up, Eli. The cabin is still warm. You've done everything you can." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he walked over to the fire, poking at the embers and adding another log to the flame. The heat surged up, but Eli was beginning to question whether it would be enough. He had designed the system with so much care, but the storm outside was something different. The wind, the snow, the shifting pressure, it was more than he could have predicted. "I don't know, Martha," he muttered, his voice tight. "It's not enough. It's not holding steady like it should. The heat isn't moving properly. The storm is too much." Martha stood beside him, her gaze steady. "We'll be okay, Eli. This cabin is still standing, and we've weathered worse before. You've made a home here. That's what matters." But Eli's mind was elsewhere. He was pacing again, looking at the ceiling, the channels, the way the heat still struggled to reach the farthest edges of the room. The system had worked well enough, but now, in the face of a storm this severe, it felt as if all his efforts might unravel. What if the heat he had redirected was still too reliant on a fire that couldn't sustain itself against the wind and snow? He glanced out the small window beside the door. The snow was thick and unrelenting, and the wind howled through the cracks in the walls. The world outside seemed as unforgiving as ever, and Eli felt the weight of it press down on him. He wasn't sure how much longer the fire could burn. How long could he keep it steady against the storm? Martha's voice broke through his thoughts. "We'll make it through. Together." Eli turned to her, his face strained. But then, as the warmth of the fire flickered, something inside him settled. The storm was fierce, but the cabin was still standing. The warmth wasn't perfect, but it was there. And for the first time in days, Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The storm would pass. They would survive. By morning, the storm had passed. The wind had quieted, and the snow had slowed to a light dusting, leaving the world outside a blanket of white. Eli stood by the window, watching the first rays of sunlight filter through the trees, casting long shadows across the snow. The cabin, though battered by the storm, stood firm. The logs creaked as the wind finally died, and the silence was almost overwhelming after the chaos of the night. Inside, the air was warmer than he had expected. The fire, though low, still provided a steady warmth, and the cabin felt surprisingly stable. Eli walked over to the hearth and poked at the embers, adding more wood. The flames flickered to life again, and for the first time in a long while, Eli allowed himself a moment of relief. Martha joined him, her eyes tired but steady. She had hardly slept during the storm, but there was a calmness to her now. She looked around the cabin, her gaze lingering on the walls, the ceiling, the space that had kept them warm and safe through the worst of the storm. "It held up," Eli said quietly, his voice hoarse from the long hours of stress and worry. "The cabin's still standing. We're still standing." Martha nodded, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You built something that could withstand anything, Eli." It was never just about keeping warm. It was about making sure we could survive, no matter what. Eli's gaze drifted to the ceiling again, the carefully carved gaps that had begun it all. The design had worked, not perfectly, but it had withstood the test of the storm. The heat had circulated enough to keep the cabin comfortable, even when the world outside had been trying to tear it apart. The fire crackled, and the warmth spread through the room. Eli felt his muscles relax for the first time in days, the tension from the storm and his doubts fading away. The storm had tested him, tested his work, but it had also shown him something important. It wasn't about perfection, it was about persistence. It was about creating something that could stand up to whatever came its way. Martha moved toward the table, placing a fresh loaf of bread down in front of him. "It's not perfect," she said, her voice gentle, "but it's enough." Eli smiled, finally able to accept the truth. It was enough. The cabin, his design, the warmth that filled it, it was more than he had ever hoped for. The storm had come and gone, and they had made it through. Not because the heat had been perfect, but because they had adapted, adjusted, and survived. He sat down at the table, breaking the bread in half. The cabin was warm. The world outside was cold. But for now, they were safe.